Hey everyone, I'm Kevin here at Victory 4x4. Today in the garage we're going to be installing our Blitz front bumper on our 3rd gen Toyota Sequoia. We'll start things off with a little bit of disassembly, specifically to get the grille and front bumper fascia assembly removed. To start things off, you can open your hood and you'll be looking for the 4 hex head bolts along the top of the grille support here. Those can be removed with a 10mm socket. Then on each side of this grille assembly, you'll have some wire harness connectors to unplug. This is the driver's side. Over here we have 2. These are both just kind of a press in tab and pull out situation. Over on the passenger side, it looks like we have 3. That number may vary depending on your specific model. Then underneath those connectors, you're going to find 1 plastic clip that needs to be removed. That you'll just need a flat screwdriver or a clip removal tool. You can get underneath the center of that, pry up, and then pull the entire clip free. You can then reach down behind the grille and remove the 2 bolts per side holding the lower grille supports to the core support. Those will again use a 10mm socket. Then moving down underneath, still with your 10mm socket, you can remove the 4 main bumper support bolts. So there's going to be 1 per side up through the fender liner in this round hole, and then 2 here in the center. Then moving out toward the ends, you can now remove the 4 main bolts holding the wheel liner to the bottom of this bumper fascia. Again, this is a 10mm, or these can be removed with a number 2 Phillips. Now, any of the hardware you see remaining right here would have been from the factory lower air dam section. That was removed early on with our vehicle and will need to be removed for your installation as well. Then continuing around into the outside of these wheel openings, you're going to have 5 more bolts to remove, with the 5th one being kind of tucked up under the side here, still with your 10mm socket. You can then grab a plastic pry tool like I have here, so we're not going to damage the paint, and pull out on just kind of the front edge here of this fender flare. We're just going to pull this out a little bit, allowing us to then move on to removing this front fascia. There should just be a couple clips holding this in place, so you can work your way around the side and free those up. That's really all the farther you need to go with the flare there, and then we can move towards popping that fascia free. You'll have to pull out just a little bit on this, and then you'll see the tab inside of here that you'll want to kind of lift off of its locator and then pull out toward the side, and that should start freeing this fascia up from its retainer along this line. That's really all the farther you want to go with this flare, and then you can just reach back here and kind of lift this upper tab off and pull out, and that'll start to pop this fascia free from the retainer along this line. From this point forward, you'll want to be pretty cautious, as well as maybe even want the help of a friend to kind of catch this fascia as it comes off of the vehicle, because once you get it popped kind of out of this upper retainer, there's not a whole lot holding it on at this point. So you'll kind of have to support this one side, go free it up on the other side, and then we'll be able to lift this whole thing straight off the front of the vehicle. With the fascia freed up from those retainers on both sides, you should be able to just grab kind of top and bottom firmly and pull straight out. Next, back up on the vehicle, we're going to be working to remove this factory crash bar assembly. First, just for hardware access on the top side here, we're going to have to remove these outer air dams. They're just going to use 4 bolts that can be removed with your 10mm socket. Then grab a 17mm socket to remove the 4 bolts per side holding that crash bar in place. Just make sure as you're taking the final hardware out that you have this supported in some fashion. And then this part can be set off to the side and will not be reused. Then moving back to the fascia here, we're going to be working to remove the majority of this wire harness along the bottom, as well as the sensors from the front of the bumper. On each of these park sensors, they're just going to be held in with a couple plastic clips. Here on this one, they'll be blue, the outer ones are red. You just have to kind of gently pry out on each of those while applying pressure back from the outside and kind of working back and forth. You should be able to free this sensor up from the front of the bumper. You can then disconnect both fog lights. These are just going to be a standard thumb style electrical connector. So just press in the tab and pull back, freeing that up. And then we can work our way along with our panel pry tool and release the clips holding the sensor in place along here. Then with the harness freed up, we can kind of just tuck that up and out of the way for now while we remove the outer black plastic panel. Then out on each end, you'll have 3 Phillips head screws that need to be removed. Followed by a series of clips along the outside perimeter of that outside trim panel. Those can be removed with your flat screwdriver and a little bit of pressure. So just pull back on the fascia section while you're pushing out on the trim panel. And you will have to kind of maintain pressure on these as you work your way around. Once you've made it all the way around and got all those clips free, it should be as simple as sliding this lower trim panel out of its tabs and away from the fascia. Then as for the part we're going to be cutting and removing, you'll basically be drawing a line kind of parallel to the factory edge you see along here, and then a little bit differently as we get down along the bottom so that we can save this mounting location. Up top here, you're basically going to come down 3/16 to 1/4 of an inch, kind of just below the top of this hole. You can be as precise or as loose here as you're comfortable with, as long as you save that material along this top edge, as that is what's going to tuck in behind the bumper once installed. Then once you get around the side here, you'll basically be using this edge as a reference and coming in about 3/8 of an inch along here, kind of just to the edge of this slotted tab location. Then as you make your way down to this bottom surface, you'll just follow this seam across. Again, we're trying to save this mounting tab, so we'll come just past it and follow its molding line right out to the edge. Now, if you're not super confident with what you see here or your measurements and marks, it's always best to be conservative, so leave a little bit extra, and then you can always kind of test fit things and trim out more as needed. Now, after you've completed that cut on both sides, make sure to clean up any rough edges. Again, that is going to be tucked behind the edge of the bumper, so not incredibly critical, but you don't want anything hanging off of there. Once you've done that, this fascia can be reinstalled on the vehicle. I, however, am going to push this off to the side just to briefly show you, while we have full access to the mounts over here, kind of how the hardware goes on those, and talk a little bit about a winch install. When you're making your cuts to the fascia, you can really use a wide range of tools. Typically, we are going to reach for something like this air saw or body saw, along with a couple different styles of cutoff wheels. These are both air cutoffs. You could also use a cutoff disc on your 4.5-inch grinder in most cases. Some of the spots on this fascia might get a little tight in some of those radiuses, so you might have to grab something a little smaller like what we showed first. And then to clean up your cuts, kind of same thing, you're going to use various types of grinders. These both have flap wheel sanding discs, but you could use just a standard round sanding disc on those as well. And if you don't have something like this, you could probably even get away with sandpaper and a block if you needed to. When you're making those cuts and when you're sanding, you are potentially producing little hot pieces of plastic. So along with that, grab your safety equipment, a decent pair of gloves, and some safety glasses should be sufficient. So in the lower holes on each of these mounts, you're going to have those 2 factory threaded nuts on the back side. So you'll reuse factory bolts there. You will, however, grab one of our washers. You're going to install that here between the bumper and the factory mount. You'll do the same thing over here, and then for the remaining 4 bolts up top, you'll want to find the 7/16 hex bolts and washers in your bolt pack. These 2 that you see here, you'll want to run the bolt from back to front like this, and then of course install the serrated flange nut to hold the bumper in place. And then using the same hardware combination in the 2 top holes here, you'll go top down and again serrated flange nut. Then as for this factory threaded stud here, we're just going to ignore that from a hardware standpoint. That'll basically just be an alignment pin as you're getting the bumper installed. So as for the winch clearance side of things, I took the liberty of throwing the bumper up here just loosely on a couple of bolts. The main issue you may encounter here is just going to be this coolant line that runs across what will be behind your winch. Now clearance there is going to vary quite a bit from one winch to the next, as they are all just a little bit different. So we have a Warn Xeon 10S that I'm going to drop in here, and we can kind of show you how that looks relative to this hose. So with this 10S, you can kind of see that the hose is just barely touching the back of the housing down here. So I've just got a Christmas tree clip style zip tie that I'm going to insert into an already existing hole in the front of this fan shroud. We can then, using the already kind of coated portion of this hose, just tie that back out of the way. You want to make sure if you're zip tying a hose like this that you're not going to pull so tight you crush the hose, but you get the clearance you need there, and you're not going to cause any damage throughout the life of the vehicle. The only other thing really to pay attention to here is the winch solenoid, as some of those may need to be relocated just due to the vertical space you have available once the fascia is installed. At this point, we are going to need to do a final test fit on these outer air dam sections. So there is going to be a little bit of interference to the bumper down here. You'll have to kind of bend that to manipulate it temporarily back into place for now. I can then take this back out and trim it up using similar tools as we did when cutting our fascia. So trim that to fit as needed. It should wind up looking something like you see here, and then you can drop that back in just to kind of check your final clearance. From here, the only other thing this may interfere with is going to be the pod lights out here on the side. So check your clearance there as well and trim to fit as needed. So as you get that stuff back out of the way, just make sure you get these bolted fully back in place, and then grab your fascia for the reinstallation. As you're putting this back in, it's a good idea to have the help of a friend just to help you get the kind of outer wings in behind the fender flares and help support this as you get your first couple bolts going into place. It can be done with one person, so just kind of take your time, make sure you're paying attention, trying not to scratch anything, and carefully getting it into position. After that, you'll come down here and reinstall the 4 bolts holding that lower metal brace into the core support. And as you'll recall from your disassembly, pretty much all of this will go back together with a 10mm socket. Then as you're making your way around toward the wheel openings and your fender flares, you want to just pay close attention to all your gaps between the fascia and the headlight, as well as the fender here, just making sure that you get this all snapped properly back into all the front fascia retainers there. Then out on this end, you'll line things up and snap your flare back into place and reinstall your coarse thread fasteners here. So with the fascia now on the vehicle, we can move to the bumper for a little bit of assembly work. We'll start out with the front logo trim plate. That, as it sounds, is going to mount to the front of the bumper. You'll use the black 1/4 button head bolts here. And then on the inside, you'll use serrated flange nuts. After you've gotten all 6 of those started, grab a 5/32 T-handle or hex driver and tighten them up. This is also a good time to find the 2 grommets for the front parking proximity sensors and just get those loosely installed into the bumper here. And then I'll grab our center light bar as well as the 2 outside pods, spin this around and show you how to get those installed. For the pod light mounting, it's pretty straightforward. We give you a slotted tab here just behind the light cutout. Other than that, you just want to pay attention to your individual light manufacturer's mounting bracket and hardware. Some of the manufacturers provide a bracket that is able to be flipped, which can kind of raise and lower the light, or simply just move it front to rear for some added adjustability. Once you're happy with the light mounting bracket, go ahead and install it down here into the slot using that manufacturer provided hardware. Now, as for the center light bar, this is set up to accept a 20-inch single row, but pay attention to the individual manufacturer's bar that you are planning to purchase. These are set up at 22 1/8 inside to inside, so just double check with your manufacturer there. The one we have here uses a stud style mounting out on the end with a nut and a washer. Some of these are going to be a bolt running from the outside into a threaded boss here on the light. With that being said, and the fact that every bar varies just a little bit in width, you may have to add a couple washers as a spacer inside of here, depending on what light you purchase. Both of these tabs are slotted, so we should be able to just slide this down into position, reinstall our hardware, and kind of line things up and tighten them up. Then lastly, this would also be a good time to get your winch installed. We're going to be proceeding on this install without a winch, but just a note, if you're installing yours, go ahead and leave the hardware just a little bit loose so you have that front to rear adjustability as this is going into place. Now we've moved our bumper over to our transmission jack so that we have a little bit of adjustability in height as we're getting it installed. Right here is now the perfect time if you're going to be wiring your pod lights into the factory wiring harness for the fog lights. You can really use any electrical connector of your choosing here as long as it's watertight. Some of your aftermarket pod lights are going to come with these already installed on one end and the corresponding section here to tie into this factory wire harness side of things. For this, you'll just cut off the factory plug. The white wire with a black stripe is going to be the ground side, leaving the green wire to be the positive power side of things. Use that information with your aftermarket wiring diagram to get these wired up. Along those same lines, you do lose some of the wire harness clip locations by removing some of this lower trim, but you do gain some additional holes with that out of the way up here where you can just simply zip tie this wire harness up into place. From here, you just want to make sure that you have at least a couple of your bolts kind of at the ready, and then we can begin to move this into place. With it kind of loosely in position and started on those 2 threaded pins, you can begin installing that hardware. Don't forget to get those washers between the bumper and the mount on these bottom bolts. So now with a couple bolts started, so we know the bumper can't fall off the vehicle, we can kind of drop our jack down and get it out of the way. And then move over here to connecting our wiring for the lights as well as getting our parking proximity sensors into position. So for these, you're just going to find that factory sensor by reaching through the access hole in the bumper. You'll want to kind of support this grommet with your hand from the outside and then push the sensor through from the inside here. Here you can see one of the sensors removed from the vehicle. The only thing I want to point out here real quick is the kind of rubber collar that they put around the outside. If you're having issues with that wanting to fall off, just put a thin bead of RTV sealant on the inside of it, put it back on and wipe any of that clean as it does cover up what you see there, that white portion of the sensor. Once you get the sensors installed on both sides, this is also when you'll typically want to plug in your pod lights and your center light bar if you haven't done so already. I didn't really mention earlier on how we're going to be wiring this center light bar, because that's going to vary kind of from individual to individual. You can wire that into an individual switch. Hopefully you can find a blank up on the dash and find the appropriate size switch to fit in there if that's the only lighting accessory you're going to add. A lot of you might wire that into a larger switch controller if you're doing a full build and installing a bunch of lights and accessories on your vehicle. So that'll kind of be up to you. Once you have all that figured out, you'll continue by installing the remaining 7/16 hardware in the orientation we showed you earlier on with that fascia removed. With all that hardware loosely started, you can access the inner hardware to tighten things up through the access holes here, and the outside hardware through the bottom before these fender liners get secured in place. Now you do want to make sure before anything's fully tightened up that you have the bumper centered from side to side, and then you can use a 5/8 wrench on the provided 7/16 hardware and a 17mm on those factory bolts on the bottom down here. You also want to make sure as you're tightening things up that everything is kind of getting snugged into place simultaneously, because a couple of these are going to pull up while the others pull back. So you may have to just kind of alternate back and forth a little bit as you do this step. Once you have the bumper tightened up to the frame, you'll come out to these two holes. There's going to be one on each wing. You'll need to find the 5/16 button head bolt and white spacer. This is going to go between the bumper and this fascia. Here you're just going with the innermost hole remaining on the fascia. They should pretty well just line up with one another. You can push that through. And then you'll be installing the 5/16 nylock flange nut up top. To tighten that up, you'll need a 3/16 hex and a 1/2" wrench. With that finished up on both sides, you're just left with reinstalling the inner fender liner to the bottom side of the fascia here. You will have to make a small cut to this end just so that this doesn't stick out through kind of the exposed vent portion of the front bumper. This can be cut pretty easily with a good pair of scissors or tin snips, and we're basically just going straight across, kind of removing this forward mounting tab. Then you should be able to push this up over the top of the bumper here and get this all lined back up and start reinstalling those factory coarse thread screws for these outside locations. I will just point out that yours may look just a little bit different than ours right here on this outside corner, as we've done just a little bit of tire clearance work in that same area, but the installation should be essentially the same, and then you can repeat this process over on the other side. And that is really pretty much it for this installation, other than those of you installing a winch that may have to still install a winch fair lead, relocate your solenoid, or finish up your winch wiring. Other than that, if you guys have any questions at all about this bumper or anything else we offer here at Victory 4x4, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always send us an email at info@victory4x4.com or call us at 269-459-8447.